So you point out that there are extremists on both sides, but that the vast majority of the violence
Yeah,
comes from people associated with the alt right. I think the percentage was something around eighty
yeah,
percent
it's a
or
lot.
four to
Yeah,
one, which I think most people sense that there's a higher propensity for instigation and violence from the right. And you do paint a picture about what a civil war could look like in the United States, which would not be a civil war in a conventional sense where you have political entities and conventional warfare, but instead you have dozens or hundreds of militias engaging in what most people would consider terrorist
yeah.
activities. How many militias are there right now in the
I
U.S.?
think there's over 400. So we were at a peak previously in 1996, and that's the year that Timothy McVeigh bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City. Militias had been growing prior to that, and then they declined after Oklahoma City, and they declined because the FBI was quite effective at going after these groups and imprisoning their leaders and infiltrating them, but also in part because I think the American public was so disgusted by what they saw that these far right groups had, or these militias had, a hard time recruiting. That shifted in 2008. Since 2008, we've seen once again the rise and a rapid rise of militias. Most of it's been on the far right. The vast majority, or I think about 65% of those far right groups are white supremacist groups. About 25% are anti federal government groups. There's some overlap between the two, but that's what we're seeing on the far right. Now, I get a lot of emails from people saying, well, what about the far left? And what about Antifa? Are you being biased by only showcasing the right? And my response to that is, there's great data on militias, and we actually know that far left militias were the majority in the 60s and 70s. So you could think about the Black Panthers, you could think about violent environmentalist groups, anarchists. So it was the left in previous decades that was dominant. They have been declining, and the far right has been growing to the point where, most of the violent extremists here in the United States are definitely on the far right. Antifa exists, but it's one group. It's small, and again, in terms of numbers, the numbers of militias on the far right is much greater.
So you paint a daunting picture. People are now picking up on it in the mainstream, and we all owe you a debt. When you started your book, you didn't know that events would then end up essentially verifying your thesis. Uh, so you do suggest some solutions. So one of the facts in your book that really struck me is that of the civil wars that occurred in democracies over a multi-decade period, none of them were in proportional democracies. They were all in majoritarian uh, or presidential systems, which the U.S. has. And you present, and I think this is correct, is that, look, people may go through the political system unless they feel
Yeah.
like there's just no hope for them. And I'm not sure if you know, but I've started the Forward Party to try to shift us towards a more
Yes.
dynamic,
Yes.
representative, multi party democracy, which I think is a must. What solutions do you think are most vital for us to try and make progress on in the time we have? Because people also know that I think Trump runs again in 24. I think he wins the Republican nomination. I think he is a very, very strong bet to win outright. Or if he doesn't win outright, say he won, and then we'll see a replay of January 6th, but on a larger scale. So I suppose I just doubled down on the very dark picture that you painted in your book. So what are the things that you are most animated about in terms of solutions? It sounds like one of them is social media for sure.
Well, that would be the easiest solution. The U.S. government regulates all sorts of industries that we know could potentially harm American citizens. We regulate the meat industry. We regulate mainstream media, television and radio. So we understand how powerful a tool media can be and how it could be used to really tear societies apart. And yet here we have this enormous media vehicle that is now dominating everything else.
It's bigger than any traditional media vehicle at this
It's where
point.
most people are
Orders of
getting their
magnitude.
news, and there's no regulation. And I actually am not somebody who advocates censoring what people put on social media platforms. I think people, for the most part, should be allowed to put whatever they want on these platforms. Free speech, go for it. What I don't believe should be allowed is for social media companies to take, again, the most divisive, the most extreme, the most incendiary material and give it an enormous audience instantaneously, and basically be a megaphone for that information, because they know that information keeps people engaged and keeps them coming back more than information that would be helpful to society. And so the fact that they're allowed to do this, and that there's no restrictions, and we're now in 2022 seeing many of the negative effects. There's all of these trends that have emerged since around the late 2000s, since 2010, the decline of liberal democracy, the rise of ethnic nationalism, the rise of hate crimes, the rise of far right extremist groups, the rise of militias. Like, all of these things are happening at this particular moment in time, and you have to ask yourself, like, what is causing it, and why is it happening now? What has changed to make this possible? And everybody keeps gravitating back to,
The answer is
yes,
social
it's
media.
social media, and the fact that there are no regulations on this, despite these really awful outcomes, is really shocking. It would be, and the 5 biggest tech companies are here in the United States. It would be easy for us to tamp down this negative bullhorn.
Well, it would be easy of us if our government was not decades behind the technological
Yes.
understanding curve. I mean, right now, even when they do have hearings on it, they berate the tech leaders about issues that strike me as
Yes, I
marginal.
agree.
I mean, like like the central problem is that they're profiting to the tune of billions of dollars by an algorithm that accelerates hatefulness, anger, fear, resentment, and oh, by the way, it's uniquely subject to foreign misinformation.
Yes. It's the backdoor way that our enemies can undercut our own society. It's, they can't take on the U.S. military. It's hard to infiltrate the United States in other ways, but boy, it's really easy via the internet, via social media.
Yeah, you also recommend, and I agree with this. I agree with just about everything you prescribe. That our government has to do better at delivering benefits to various folks, and you suggest things like maybe healthcare, maybe maybe something that they know that is a win for them. I like cash. That's one of my preferred mediums. And you described this as outbidding, which I found to be a really interesting frame. It was like a political science term. But that when people are incited to violence, there's like a bid for their loyalty from extremist groups or from ethnic entrepreneurs or whatever. And you suggest, look, the government can outbid these other groups.
So, we didn't have an ethnic faction in this country really until recently. America didn't have racially based parties. As late as 2008, white Americans were equally likely to vote for Democrats as they were to vote for Republicans. But that changed when Barack Obama came to power. And that's when the white working class and that group had traditionally been supporters of the Democratic Party, and they supported the Democratic Party because the Democrats, the social and the economic policies were more aligned with working class interests than the Republican Party's policies. And they began to gravitate towards the Republican Party because the Republican Party was offering other things. They were using cultural issues. They were playing on fears of changing demographics. So they were offering other things to the white working class. And then the question is, okay, why were they able to do this? And I think one of the answers is that both the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party also, they in some ways didn't protect the white working class from the negative effects of globalization. Bill Clinton signed NAFTA. Bill Clinton signed NAFTA. That on average helped Americans, but there were losers in NAFTA here in the United States, and that was mostly white working class men who used to have good union jobs that allowed them to lead solid middle class lives. And
Yes.
when those manufacturing jobs left, the Democrats didn't put in place a safety net to help that group. And in fact, both parties have been reducing social services over time to middle class, working class, and poor Americans. And so there are real grievances out there. But when you think of the Sons of the Soil, and this is groups that had once been dominant politically and economically. These are groups who enjoyed lots of privileges, who are then seeing that their status is declining relative to other groups. I think that's what happened.
Or on an absolute
Yes.
scale, because their life expectancy is diminishing. That's not relative. That's it's just
and
reality.
their divorce rates are increasing. They're less likely to own homes, and there's a whole series of social indicators where they have declined.
Yes.
And Latinos and African Americans, for example, at worst they've remained steady, and so that is building resentment. Why are we doing worse when in fact we should be doing better than everybody? And that's where that this deep sort of anger and resentment comes from.